Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Living Manna Church. I am Pastor Dave Sains. This is our Wednesday night Bible study. I welcome you to it. Thank you so much for hanging out with me this morning, hanging out with me tonight. We are in the book of Romans. We've been in it for quite some time. I believe tonight is study number 9 that we're going to be into. I just want to, a little housekeeping before we jump into everything. If this is your first time checking us out, make sure that you hit the like button if you like the material. Hit the subscribe button if you want to get some more information about who we are and when we post other videos. And certainly join us in the conversation. You can join right up and leave a comment. Let us know where you're watching from, who you are. Give us any comments or feedback on the information. We'd love to hear it and get back to you. So with all of that, let's just say a quick prayer and we'll jump right into the study for tonight. Father, we love you. We thank you. We ask you, as always, for eyes to see, ears to hear, and hearts that are willing to obey. In Yeshua's name. Amen. All right, guys, let's do this. Let's jump right into this. Got a whole bunch of neat stuff to share with you tonight. Tonight's study is Romans, and this is part 9. We're not in chapter 9. We're actually going to be in chapter 5 again, where we didn't finish it last time. So we're going to backtrack just a little bit. We're going to go through chapter 5, and we're going to just get into chapter 6 and probably right up to verse 1, which happens to be the kickoff verse for us tonight, the thought, if you would, that the message is going to be centering around, or the study will be centering around, and that is Romans chapter 6 and verse 1, and it says the following: "What then shall we say? Shall we continue in sin to let favor," or grace, "to let favor increase?" Now, most of us are familiar with this verse. This is obviously out of the Scriptures version, but when you read this out of King James or NIV or some other variation of the Scripture, it will say almost the same thing. What then shall we say? Shall we continue in sin and to let grace increase? We're going to talk about grace a little bit. We're going to just kind of skirt the issue of grace today. We're going to pick this up again. I know we weren't able to do it last week on our Hidden Manna, but we're going to pick up that conversation again this upcoming week about grace. So I'm going to do a little bit on it tonight, but we're going to go into much greater depth on that issue or that topic this upcoming Sabbath, this upcoming Saturday. So make sure you stay tuned for that. That's Saturday at 10 o'clock. But here we are. We're in the book of Romans. We've been talking about it for some time now, and let's do just a little bit of review, if you would. Now, I've given you some idioms before. We've talked about, I've used some phrases that are secular phrases, but they have a really important meaning that absolutely apply to the story as it's being given or written by the Apostle Paul. The book of Romans, unfortunately, the book of Romans is very misunderstood. It's misunderstood, I guess, because of preconceptions, because many do not truly understand what the Torah is about, or don't understand what was going on in the first century, what the issue actually was in the first century. So the study is really an attempt to try to put that all back together and to give you the entire story. And as I said, to do that, I use some idioms, some phrases that really do kind of encapsulate what it is that the writer, Shaul, Paul, is trying to tell us. And I used a phrase, actually, in chapter 4. We went through all of chapter 4 last week. We just got into chapter 5. But I said the words, the horse, actually the cart before the horse was the phrase that I used. It's a very popular phrase, or a common phrase in the English vernacular. But in chapter 4, Abraham is the example that Shaul is using. That's the Torah example that Shaul is using to help us understand the process of justification. How does this thing work? As opposed to the way that Pharisaic Judaism was pushing their belief on the early believers, on Judah and all the people who were coming into faith through Yeshua. Now, in chapter 4, Abraham becomes the example, as he should. Abraham's the first one. He's the beginning of everything. And he is the Torah example that Shaul uses to make his point. Shaul in chapter 4 puts the horse before the cart, which is the right way to do it. Because the term cart before the horse, you can see the little picture that's up there right next to me. To put the cart before the horse are to do things in the wrong order, from back to front. You're really supposed to do things from front to back. And down on the bottom, of course, this little meme, it says, it's like having dessert before you have dinner. Now, listen, I'm not opposed to having some dessert before you have dinner. That doesn't quite fit the model of what we're talking about here. But you get the idea. It is doing things in an incorrect order. Now, listen, you can eat dessert before you have your dinner. It's not going to really, the world's not going to fall apart because you do that. But there are some things like what Shaul is talking about, justification, that have an order to them. And if you mess up the order, if you don't understand the order, you can be in error. You can be misled. You can be led away by what the Pharisees, what the Pharisaic Judaism of the day was teaching. So Shaul in chapter 4 put it in correct order. He put the horse before the cart. And basically it was this, that to have right standing in Yah is by faith only. And it starts with Abraham. He's the first example. Right standing with God is by faith. Then the cart. So the by faith is the horse. That's the right way it's supposed to go. You are succumbed by faith. There is nothing else that we can do. There is nothing we can do. There is nothing, there is no righteousness in us that we could do something to boast to God and say, I have earned your justification. That just does not happen. And this is what Shaul is saying, that faith brings right standing, or what we commonly call righteousness. Now, it's kind of difficult because there's really two definitions of righteousness. There is right standing, that is the thing that you get by faith. And then there is righteousness, which is right living, which is doing that which is right. They're both a form of righteousness, but here they're being used, the description that Shaul is using is very, very different. He's talking about our right standing before God, our justification, if you would. But once you are justified, once you've got the horse, then you need the cart. And the cart is the works. Or in the Hebrew, that word works would be the mitzvah. We would know it as commandments. And they are done not to get justification. They are done out of love, out of our heart. Our heart's desire is to do them. Not because we're going to earn something or get some favor of God, but because we love him. This is exactly what Yeshua meant when he said, if you love me, obey my commandments. That is the exact thing that Yeshua was talking about as the horse before the cart. But the cart before the horse issue was the issue of Pharisaic Judaism, religion of its day. And Pharisaic Judaism, the cart before the horse, taught that you needed to do mitzvah. You needed to do works, culminating with circumcision as the end cap, the physical outward form to show that you have done all of the mitzvah. It's called halakha. The rules, the regulations. They still have it today. They still do halakha today. The rules, the regulations, the things you have to do to become a Jew, to convert to Judaism. Well, it was a very, very similar issue in that day, but that was the cart before the horse. The works, or really, even when we say Torah, we're really talking about, yes, it is Torah. It absolutely means Torah. You cannot do Torah to be justified. But it's also referring to the traditions of the fathers, the way the Pharisees, the Pharisaic Judaism, taught Torah. It's the traditions, it's all of the add-ons, it's all of the ceremony, all of those other things that made Torah a burden. that made it the thing Yeshua said was a heavy yoke. Their concept was if you do works first, then you earn right standing before the Lord. That, of course, is the cart before the horse, or as the sign says there, to do things in the wrong order, back to front. Now, remember, guys, that this is what we've kind of gone over. This is the story from chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, all the way up to chapter 4. And Shaul is trying to deal with the number one issue in the first century. That is people coming out of Pharisaic Judaism. That was the issue. That's not really the issue today, but that was the issue. We got lots of other issues that we got to deal with today. But that was the issue of the first century, the influence of Pharisaic Judaism upon the first century believers, both Jewish and those who were coming from the nations. So with that, our next slide, this up. Another term that I kind of used, and again, I wanted to give you just something to visualize. We're going to do a lot of visual stuff today, because it's easier sometimes to learn with a picture. You get it in your mind, you hear it, you see it. Well, the term that I used is the baby with the bathwater. Again, another very common term, vernacular, in the English language. And this goes all the way back, to the days when, there was no sewage. You didn't, dump things down the toilet or in the tub or in the sink. You literally just took your stuff and you threw it out the window and it went into the street. Well, the idea was that you bathed your baby, and be careful not to throw, when you throw the bath water out, that you throw the baby with it. And of course, you can see the little comic right next to it, the meme right next to it. That's what it means to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The bathwater is dirty. The bathwater is no good. You don't need it. But the baby's good. You want to keep the baby. And this idea of throwing the baby out with the bathwater is really the issue of today. This was, again, a very, very separate issue that was going on in the first century, being pulled out of Judaism. We have a different issue because we read things like this. Now, this is jumping ahead a little bit. This is Romans chapter 6 and verse 14. So we're jumping ahead just a little bit, but it kind of makes the case. Romans 6 verse 14 says, "For sin shall not rule over you, for you are not under the law, but under favor." Now, if you just read that all by itself, without any understanding of what we went through in chapters 1 through 4, without any understanding of what Yeshua has said, without any understanding of what the Torah is supposed to be, you could read that and come to the conclusion that, well, we don't need the law. And what we've done in our modern age is we've taken the baby and the bathwater, that which is good and that which is out of order, and we've gotten rid of both of them. Both what was going on in the first century through Pharisaic Judaism and what we do today, both are in error, and we need to go back and we need to relearn this and try to really understand it the way that the apostle is teaching it, the way Yeshua taught it. Remember, Pharisaic, when we say Torah, we are talking about the Torah. There's no doubt about it. When it says we're not under the law, we are not. The Torah does not justify us. We're going to talk a little bit more, or talk about the position of the Torah by the time we get to the end of tonight. But don't forget, we're also talking about the Pharisaic Torah, the oral Torah, the laws, the traditions of the fathers. Those things are also engulfed in this idea of law, or coming out of Judaism, as Paul is preaching and teaching here in Romans and Galatians and all of the other books. And guys, once you understand this, if you can get this concept down, then all the other books will begin to make sense. When you realize that you can't put the cart before the horse, there's an order to things. That's all Shaul is trying to say in his book. But also, don't make the mistake of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because both of them are going to get us in trouble. And the incredible thing is that Shaul knew this, Paul knew this, and he actually addresses this in Romans as we continue on within the book. So, with that being said, let's look at some words of Yeshua, because Yeshua told us the very same things. Here is Matthew chapter 23 and verse 1. Then Yeshua spoke to the crowds and taught his disciples, his taught ones, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses. Therefore, whatever they say to you, to guard. Now, it's really important, that word guard, because it appears all over the Torah. Every time Yah says, now in the English we'll read, keep the commandments, but the word is really guard the commandments, or uphold the commandments. And so that's what Yeshua is saying here. When they read Moses to you, when they sit in Moses' seat and they read the Torah to you, guard the commandments, guard what they say. Not what they say, guard what Moses says. Guard it, he says, and do it. But do not do according to their works, their mitzvahs, their rules, their laws, their traditions, whether it's the washing of the hands, the washing of the pots, the 6 empty water pots, you can't spit on the ground. I mean, all of these different things is what Yeshua is talking about, the traditions that have made the Word of God, the Torah of God, of no effect. See, this is not something Shaul is just kind of dreaming up. He's not just coming up with this out of left field. All of this is information Yeshua already went over, but you need to be sensitive to it to understand that's what he's talking about here. He's actually telling us, guys, this is instruction from Yeshua. If there is anybody that we need to take plainly, clearly, to take him at his literal word, it is Yeshua. We can get confused sometimes reading Shaul. I'll give you that. We'll look at some things that are a little confusing today. We'll try to put them in order. But unless you create a baseline, unless you know what the truth is that Yeshua taught, before you start reading Galatians and Ephesians and Romans and all the rest of that, if you don't understand what Yeshua taught, you'll never understand any of the rest of it, because it'll seem contradictory. And that's what it very often is today. It's contradictory. It's contradictory to what Yeshua is saying here. He's telling us, guard the commandments. Do what they say when they read Moses, but don't do the things they do. And look at what he says about it. But do not do, right after it says guard and do in red, but do not do according to their works, what they call the Torah, the oral Torah, the traditions of the fathers. But it is the mitzvah too, because the mitzvah was in there, the Torah was in there. For they say and do not do, for they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders. That's what it became. A heavy burden, a religious burden. Sure, if you have to do this, that, and the other thing just to be justified before God, that's a burden, because if you mess up, then there's other laws you got to do to make sure you clean up the thing that you messed up. This is why Yeshua tells us, my burden is light, my yoke is easy. This is what he's talking about. He's saying what they were doing was not Moses. What they were teaching was not Torah. It was Pharisaic Judaism. They called it law, but it was Pharisaic Judaism, and it became a heavy burden. But with their finger, they do not wish to move them. And guys, later on in chapter 23, Yeshua just continues on in just berating the religion of the day. So again, Shaul's not coming up with this by himself. He is telling us what Yeshua has already established. Because look what it says in chapter 23. I didn't put down the verse. You can scroll through yourself and check it out. But this is the same chapter, and Yeshua starts to go through the woes. And he says, but woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut up the rain of the heavens. You close the kingdom of God, is I think the way the King James might say it. You close up the kingdom of God from men. What you are teaching, what you are doing is stopping men from entering the kingdom. Guys, think about how heavy that is. That's why Shaul is so upset and has a difficult time with every synagogue he goes to, every congregation he goes to. That's why he deals with this in Galatians and Ephesians and Romans and Corinthians. He's got to deal with it over and over and over again because this is what this was the issue of the day. This is what Pharisaic Judaism was doing. He goes on to say, you Pharisees, you hypocrites, because you shut up the kingdom of heaven before men, for you do not go in, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. So there's people that really start to come by faith, even in that day, even before Shaul begins to tell us what he's telling us in Romans. There were people that were coming that really did want to know Yah, but once they were affected or infected by the Pharisaic teaching, look at what he says. Not only did the Pharisees not go in, but the people who listened to them, they didn't go in as well. I think that was one of our morning mannas this past week, where the disciples are upset because Yeshua really ticked off the Pharisees. They were mad at him. They were upset. And Yeshua says to them, every plant that my Father has not planted, he will pluck up, and it's going to burn. They are the blind. Leave them alone. They are the blind leading the blind. Wow, those are heavy, heavy words. But understand what he's talking about, Pharisaic Judaism. So I know a little bit of review for everybody, but this is really, really important stuff for us to understand. Because if you can get this, if we can make the baseline Yeshua, if we can understand what Yeshua is teaching, then we will be better equipped to understand what Shaul or Saul or Paul, whichever name you want to give him, what he later on is teaching. And it will make his teachings that much easier to understand. All right, well, here's what seems like, because again, the issue of our day is the baby in the bathwater, not so much the cart before the horse, but the baby in the bathwater. We're all about faith, but we're missing something else there. We threw everything out. In Romans chapter 4 and verses 2 and 3, listen to what it says. Now this is Shaul. This is Paul. For if Abraham, remember he's the example, was declared right, in right standing, or righteous by works, he would have grounds for boasting, but not before Elohim. For what does the scripture say? And he's going to quote Genesis, don't even remember where it is. I think it's Genesis 15:6, maybe somewhere around there. You guys can look it up. Maybe give me jot it down for me. It says, Abraham believed Elohim, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. We went over this in great detail weeks and weeks ago. He's saying Abraham came by faith. If Abraham came by works, remember, Abraham's the example. This is his Torah example to teach us how we come through Yeshua, the same way Abraham came by faith. Romans chapter 3 and verse 27, along the same lines, it says, where then is the boasting? It is shut out. By what Torah? Of works? Can you work? Did Abraham work? No, Abraham came by faith. No, but by the Torah of belief. There's not only a Torah of works, there's a Torah of faith. The Torah, so often we think the Torah is just one-dimensional. It only does one thing. And Paul describes the Torah and describes it sometimes as to what it's doing with regard to the topic he's talking about. But the Torah has many, many different aspects to it. It is a Torah of works. It is a Torah that teaches righteousness. It's also a Torah of death. It's also a Torah of faith or a Torah of belief. All of these things are true at the same time. It just depends on what aspect you're referring to. So he says, no, he didn't come by a Torah of works. Abraham came by faith, a Torah of belief, an instruction of belief. God spoke to him, that's Torah. When God speaks, that's Torah, and Abraham believed. For we reckon that a man is declared right by faith, belief, without the works of the Torah. Now, I said these not conflicting statements. It's not these two statements. It's the next statement that many look at and they think, well, this is contradictory. The Bible's contradicting itself. Or many today just ignore and forget about and just read this and say, see, he's telling us you don't have to keep the Torah. That is not what he is telling us. He's telling us you don't have to do works. That is not what he's telling us. He's putting the horse before the cart, but he's telling us the horse is faith. You got to come by faith, and you cannot use the Torah to do that. You cannot use works to do that. Now, here's what might seem contradictory to people, and let's put it in perspective. Let's really test this. James chapter 2 and verses 21 through 22. Also, another leader in the church. It's one of the books that we're found in the New Testament. It's instruction for us. It's Yah's instruction. It's commentary on the Torah, just like Shaul is commentary on the Torah. James chapter 2, verses 21 through 22. Look at what he says about Abraham. Was not Abraham, our father, declared right by works? Whoa, wait a minute. That's the total opposite of what we just said that Shaul was saying. Is James putting the cart before the horse here? No, he's not. As a matter of fact, he's clarifying what Shaul didn't talk about, because this wasn't part of the topic. Shaul's trying to teach the order, the first step, because that's what they need to know. Here, James is trying to teach the bigger step, the whole issue. Here's the whole issue. Was not Abraham our father declared right by works when he offered Isaac, his son, on the slaughter place? Do you, now of course he's talking about Genesis 22. We'll look at that in a second. Do you see that faith was working with his works? Paul's talking about the order. James is talking about the mechanism. James is now getting into the cart. He's telling us about the cart. Works matter. They're part of the whole issue. They are the other side of the coin, the horse and then the cart. He's describing the cart to us. And he's saying that Abraham was justified by his works. Why? Because his works exemplified his faith, which came first. So he's not in disagreement. This is not in disagreement with what Shaul said. This is not in conflict with what we just read. Let's read on just a little bit. Do you see that the belief was working with his works, or his faith was working with his works? And by the works, the faith was perfected. It was shown to be perfect. There's probably a better way in English for us to understand it. It exemplified, it proved his faith. By his faith, his actions declared his faith. So James is telling us it's not just the horse. If you just want to, as literal as we can get it, it's not just the horse. Shaul's talking about the horse, but it's not just the horse. Verse 23, and the scripture was filled, which says, Abraham believed Elohim, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. He's quoting the very same scripture that Shaul was quoting when Shaul said he was not justified by his works or made right before God. He was made right before God by faith. Both are absolutely true statements. One is the horse. This is the horse and the cart. And he called him who loves Elohim. This is Yah speaking about Abraham. You see then that a man is declared righteous by works, and not by faith alone. Faith is the first step that puts us in right standing with Yah. But now here James or Yaakov is telling us about the cart, the other step. And that's what most people miss. Most people forget about it, don't realize it, or they just ignore this. They ignore the book of James because it creates too many problems. But here it is. So we have to be able to make sense of Galatians, of Ephesians, of Romans, in conjunction with James and all of the other books. They do not conflict. And if they do conflict in the way that you're reading them, it's not the books that conflict, it's you that is being conflicted. Your understanding is skewed somewhere. You got to go back and you got to understand the words of Yeshua first. Understand what he said first. His words are the Torah. Everything he taught was the Torah. Understand what he says and then trust it. When Yah speaks, when Yeshua speaks, we can trust that. Trust when he says that it is one way, that it will always be that way, and there will be no apostle that will teach against it. And if it seems like an apostle is teaching against what Yeshua said, the problem is us. You got to go back and you got to understand it correctly. So I hope that helps. I really, really do, because this really is a big issue in our world today, in the religious world for a long time. And of course, here is what both Saul, and Yaakov, James, are actually referring to. And when you read out of the Torah, you can see that both are right, because it's Genesis 15 that says, he believed by faith and he's given to righteousness. Now here we are, Genesis 22, many years later. And now look what the Torah written by Moses about Abraham says about Abraham. Yaakov is right. James is correct. And Shaul is correct. They're both correct. Genesis chapter 22 and verse 16 says, and he said, this is Abraham offering up Isaac on Mount Moriah. It says, by myself I have sworn, declares Yehovah, because, I mean, this is an English word. I should have maybe looked it up to give you the Hebrew word. Maybe somebody can do that and check it out. But this connects the two things. This is a cause and effect verse. You did this, and because this was done, now this will be done. The promise was given many years before Abraham believed it. But now we're talking about the mitzvah. We're talking about the obedience to Yah's commandments. Because I have sworn, declares Yehovah, because you have done this, mitzvah, action, obedience, and have not withheld your son, your only son, that I shall certainly bless you, and I shall certainly increase your seed as the stars of the heavens and the sand which is on the seashore. But Abraham already believed that. Here, we know that, Genesis 15. Now Yah's saying, yeah, but now I could see in your actions, in your obedience to what I said to do, you do believe. This is proof, or as James said, and let's just look back at James just one more time, in the red there in the middle, and the works of faith were perfected. That's what he's saying here. So let's go back to where we just were. I shall certainly increase your seed as the stars of the heavens. This is the promise of Genesis 15. And the sand of the seashore, and let your seed possess the gate of their enemies. And in your seed, we now know this is Yeshua, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because, here's the because again, cause and effect, because you have obeyed my voice. When you obey Yah's voice, you are obeying his commandments, his instruction, his Torah, his law. There may not have been a written Torah and law as of Abraham's time, but any time God speaks, that is Torah. Torah just means instruction. I know we use the word law, but it really just means instruction. Well, look at this. This is the Torah testimony of Abraham, as given, again, written by Moses. But now this is the story of Isaac, the inheritor of these promises. This is now Genesis 26. So we went from Genesis 15 to Genesis 22. 15 is of faith. 22 is faith perfected by works, the horse and the cart. Now here we have a little commentary on all of this. So again, guys, Shaul is not just coming up with this stuff. He's systematically looking back at the story and taking it apart step by step by step to teach us the process, as is James, as did Yeshua as well. Genesis chapter 26, verses 2 through 5 say the following. And Yehovah appeared to him and said, do not go down to Mitzrayim. Live in the land which I command you, sojourn in this land. And I shall be with you and bless you, for I give all these lands to you and to your seed. And I shall establish the oath which I swore to Abraham your father. So he's just re-giving the promises that were given to Abraham to Isaac. Isaac also had to believe them by what? By faith. Verse 4, and I shall increase your seed like the stars of the heaven, and I shall give all these lands to your seed, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. And look at verse 5. Here it is. Here it is, guys. This is Torah. This is Torah. This is right out of the first 5 books, written by Moses. Do what Moses said, not what the Pharisees say. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and guarded, there's that word again, every time we see it with the commandments, it's guard or to uphold, guard my charge, my commands, my commandments, my laws, and my Torah, or Torah, his law, his instruction. So here's the Torah summary, if you would, by Yah, of what the process was. And what did he say Abraham did? He came by faith, and then he obeyed my instructions. Abraham is the example, and this example stays consistent throughout the scripture. Now, by the time the Pharisees come on the stage, they didn't know any of this. They rejected it. They picked their own religion. They made up their own rules. They did not understand what Shaul was talking about. They could not see it. They did not have eyes to see. And I hope that tonight that you truly do. Okay, so hopefully we've made the case here. Again, we're just trying to do what Shaul did. We're trying to make the case. We're trying to build it scripture upon scripture upon scripture, starting with the Torah and working its way all the way through, because that's the only way to understand. Again, if you do not have a baseline, if you do not have a foundation, I guess is maybe a better way of saying it. If you do not have if you don't know what is true and right by the time Yeshua is giving it, you can't just read Galatians and decide to interpret it with no understanding of what came before. And then, guys, that's what we do. That's what I hear so many do that. I did it. We all did it. We all did it. We all read it. We all went through the New Testament books. Somebody told us you get saved, you open up the book, start reading the book of John, and then read the other New Testament books, and that's what you'll learn about faith. We read them, and we had no idea what we were reading about. No idea of the history, no idea where it comes from, really no idea of the context. And we've made some big, big mistakes because of it. All right, so let's now jump into chapter 5. I know we read some of chapter 5 already, but we're gonna go back through. There's some highlight things. There's some things I want to highlight and bring out to you, and we'll build again our case. And I promise you, we will get to chapter 6, but probably not much further than verse 1. But we're gonna get there. But I want you to understand the process as we build layer upon layer of truth here. So Romans chapter 5 and verse 1. Therefore, having been declared right by belief. So he's assuming, listen, you just understood everything I said in chapters 1 through 4, even though Shaul didn't write in chapters, but you get the meaning. So now that you believe, now that you understand that it is by faith, therefore, that's what therefore means. It's a summary of everything else that just went before. That's a very important word. We'll talk more about it later. Therefore, having been declared right by faith, we have peace with Elohim through our Master Yeshua Messiah. And I put in parentheses there because don't forget, we've already learned, and we'll look at that verse in just a second, that in Galatians, Paul makes the very astute observation that Yah was speaking about many stars as all of the different generations that will come, but the seed as a singular seed to come, and that seed is Messiah. So the promise is given to Abraham from his son to all of his kids, to the nation, to the land, to resurrection, to all of those things. Part of the promise, part of the oath was Yeshua. Yeshua was part of the promise. So the promises were made to Abraham. The oath was made to Abraham. And now we're finding out, here's the mystery of the kingdom. Now we're finding out that Yeshua is the answer or the payment of that oath. This is critical. This is huge. This is very, 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 very important and very, very big. I know I've gone over this before, but again, just so we're all on the same page here. So again, through Elohim, through our Master Yeshua Messiah, and I'm putting in red there, this is PD, putting this in, who is the answer to the oath made to Abraham. Through whom, so Yeshua's coming is not separate and distinct from the promises given to Abraham. It is the fulfillment of the promises given to Abraham. It is the way it will all be fulfilled. This was always part of the plan. We treat what Yeshua has done today, and again, it's how we were taught. It's what we were told. We treat what Yeshua has done as some separate and distinct and new thing when it is not. It is the very answer to what Yah promised in an oath to Abraham to begin with. And we've got to understand that, guys. This is a key component to understanding what the whole book is about. Through whom we also have access by faith into this favor, this grace. Every time you see that word favor in the scriptures version, in most of the other versions, it'll say the word grace, in which we stand. And we exalt in the expectation of the esteem, of the glory. We look forward to the glory of God, in other words, is what he's saying. And not only this, but we also exalt in pressures, knowing that pressure works endurance, and endurance approvedness, and approvedness expectation. And expectation does not disappoint, because the love of Elohim has been poured out in our hearts by the set-apart Spirit which was given to us. Let me summarize this real quick, because I'm not going to get too in-depth into this, but what he's saying is, if you realize we're now at peace with Yah, and what a wonderful gift that is, then all the hardships, all the perseverance, the endurance, all this other stuff he's talking about, is so much easier now to endure because you know who you are. You know the promise is real. You know Yeshua is the answer to it. You know that you stand correct with your God. So you can now deal with all of these other things very, very differently than you may have dealt with them before you came to faith. That's in essence what he's saying. And of course, just look at Shaul's life and all the stuff he went through. I mean, that guy went through some crazy stuff, and yet it was the expectation of the glory, as he says, the glory or the esteem of Elohim, that kept him going. He knew who he was, and it didn't matter what happened. He knew this was not the life, this was not the only thing for us, but that there is a resurrection to come. So I'm going to put that aside, because we'll talk. Maybe we'll talk about this at another point when Shaul goes through all of his list of the things that he does and goes through. But for now, and we get this confidence through the set-apart Spirit that is in us when and if we put the horse and then do the cart. Verse 6, for when we were still weak, Messiah in due time died for the wicked. Okay, so I'm not going to make too much more commentary on that, because I want to zip through some of this, because we went over some of this already. However, as I said, Messiah is the oath or the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham. He is that seed. When he says your seed, in your seed. Let me see if I can go back and actually get that verse of that, because I want you to really, really see it. This is Genesis 22. Again, look at verse 17. Because you had not withheld your only son, that I shall certainly bless you, and I shall certainly increase your seed as the stars of the heavens and the sand which is on the seashore, and let your seed possess the gate of their enemies. He's talking about the house of Israel, all the people, the descendants that will come. But verse 18, and in your seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed. Well, look at what Shaul kind of figured out. Again, this is by revelation. Now we're going to jump into Galatians here to get a little bit more insight. But in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16, look at what Shaul figured out. Look at what Yah gave him. This is the gift of interpretation we're seeing here. He realized something that nobody realized before. This is a mystery of the kingdom. He's realizing something. But the promises were spoken to Abraham. Okay, we got that. We went over that. And to his seed. And you think he's talking about Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Aaron and yada, yada, and yada, yada. No. Shaul, maybe it seemed like he's splitting spiritual hairs here, but he's not. This is really, really important. And to his seed. He does not say, and to seed. So he's making a distinction between something singular and something plural. He's saying this is singular. And you'll notice it's capitalized in the English because it's referring to a proper noun here, or it refers to a proper noun or a name of a person. And to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed who is Messiah. So when he tells Abraham in Genesis 22, and in your seed all the nations will be blessed. Shaul is telling us that is a prophecy of the coming Messiah who would be the promise given to Abraham. How do all these promises get given to the nations? How does the land get given? How does it comes through the seed. Now the seed has come. Yeshua has come. And now we need to understand this whole story in the context of the seed that has now come. Now, here's what's important. The promise, and here, again, we're going back a little bit as to what Shaul's already said, but it's also going to be said again in the next couple of verses. This promise did not come through the Torah or by the Torah. The promise came by the seed. Important distinction. When Abraham was given the promises, part of the promises that he was given was not for a written Torah. That was not part of the promises. That came later on, and it has a purpose, but that's not part of the promise. The promise was a seed so that all nations will inherit these promises and become part of the house of Israel. So the promise was not by the Torah. So if the promise is not by the Torah, how can then keeping the Torah to earn justification, because that's the issue, how can Pharisaic Judaism then say that to keep the Torah is how you earn justification, salvation, deliverance before our God? It can't. And that's what he's telling us here. And if you read the next couple of verses in Galatians, he'll make that clear. And we're going to take a little bit look at that as well in just a few minutes. So the promise is not through the Torah, but the promise is by the seed who is Yeshua Messiah. John chapter 8 and verse 56, Yeshua has to be the baseline. He has to be the foundation. Yeshua already told us this. Now, Shaul's figuring it out. He's putting two and two together. He's looking at the Torah. He's kind of, he's doing what we're doing. He's taking line upon line, and he's kind of saying, let's build this, and here's the discussion. Here's the progressive thinking. But Yeshua already said this in John chapter 8 when he's arguing with them over whether they're Abraham's children or not. In verse 56, Yeshua says, your father Abraham was glad that he should see my day. And he saw it and he did rejoice. Do you realize what Yeshua is saying? He's actually telling us, if you really read into this, if you really understand what Yeshua is saying, and now understand it as Shaul is telling us, the promise of the seed was the promise of the coming Messiah. Yeshua is telling us Abraham knew it. Abraham was told a Messiah was coming. Abraham was told a seed was coming. Abraham was told my day was coming, and Abraham saw it. He saw it when he went to Mount Moriah, and he lived out the whole sacrificial, the sacrifice of his only begotten son. He lived it out for us. He saw it. And so wonderful, wonderful verse. So here's Yeshua declaring it. Again, the baseline. We need to take Yeshua at his word. Literally. Guys, he is the God of Mount Sinai in flesh form, in human form, speaking to us, which makes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John Torah. Of course, it's Torah because that's what he teaches, but the literal, every red letter are the very words of Yehovah in the flesh. So a neat verse that, again, just building the baseline to see where this actually comes from. Okay, so let's get back to reading some more of Romans. We're now at around verse 7, not verse 77, it's verse 7. It says, the next verse, for one shall hardly die for a righteous one, though possibly for a good one, someone would even have the courage to die. He's speaking, of course, of what Yeshua has done. And, there's good people and maybe somebody. In fact, Yeshua says something very similar, no greater love. In fact, I think we're going to go over that verse in just a second. Has any man but that he give his life. Verse 8, but Elohim proves his own love for us. So he's told us, he's declared it, but even Elohim is going to prove. He's going to do work. He proves his own love for us in that while we were yet sinners. And I put this in yellow so that you really highlight this. We've gone over this before, so I don't want to, go through all the passages in 1 John and things like that. But you have to have correct definitions if you're going to understand what's being said. When he talks about us being sinners, remember, sin is transgression of God's law, his Torah, his instruction. That's what sin actually is. So if he died for us when we were sinners, he died for us when we were all in disobedience to God's instruction. That's got to be the definition. That is the biblical definition. We cannot insert some sort of cultural definition, some sort of religious, modern religious definition. We think, being a sinner means, I'm a bad guy. I'm a rotten husband. I'm a bad father. I cheated on my wife. That is sin. There's no doubt about all that. Those are sinful acts. But the sin is that when you do that, you are disobeying the instructions that have already been given by Yah. We now know them because they're there, they're listed, they're in a book. That's what sin is. So that has to be the definition that we use as we go forward. It's the definition Yeshua used. It is, depart from me, you lawless ones. The word sometimes is iniquity in some of the King James and others, but it's lawless. It means without Torah, without instruction. You are disobedient to his instruction. Those are the ones that he says, depart from me, I never knew you. The only way to know him is through his instruction. It says Messiah died for us. Verse 9, much more then, having now been declared right by his blood. Now, I'm not going to get into this except just to say it. I'm not going to get into this in depth. This is, we can go around the mountain 3 or 4 times just on this subject. But it says we have been declared right by his blood. That is a temple sacrificial Torah principle. All of this is. Guys, again, there is nothing in the New Testament writings anywhere that is not Torah. All of it is Torah. Everything Shaul teaches, everything Peter teaches, everything James teaches, everything Yaakov teaches, or John, all of it, everything Yeshua says, all of it is Torah or a commentary on Torah. So why does Yeshua's blood save us? Because we hear we've all heard the invitation. Come. He died for he's God in the flesh. He died for you. Why? Why does that? Why does that matter? What? How do I know that that is true? We know it is true because of the Torah, because the principle of blood covering is a Torah principle. So I'll mention that. I'll leave that right there. You can run with that yourselves and go chase it down and look up all the different sacrifices and we'll do that another day, another time. But there it is. So another Torah principle. Right, by his blood we shall be saved from wrath through him. The wrath to come, the judgment to come is part of your deliverance. For if being enemies. Now we're going to talk about this more later. In fact, I think I mentioned this last week as well. But think about that for a second. When we were sinners, which is what this is talking about, we were enemies to Yah. Again, we're going to talk more about that later. I just want you to let that percolate for a second. Let that sink in. We were enemies when we are sinners. We are enemies to our God. Now, peace has been declared, a truce, and we have been declared right with him. Think of how important that truly is. Again, we're going to go over this much, much later. We'll talk about what it means to be an enemy, and we'll chase this down through the scripture, and we'll get some sort of an understanding on that. But I'm just mentioning it for now. It says, being enemies, we were restored to favor with Elohim through the death of his son. If his death restores us to God's favor, or let's use the word grace, because that's the word that we're most familiar with and the word that we most abuse. Because of Yeshua's death, the promise, the fulfillment of the promise given to Abraham, because of his death, salvation comes to the nations. If his death does that, much more, having been restored now, we shall be saved by his life. So not only are we learning here that the sacrifice of Yeshua has a potent effect in bringing us into right standing, but the resurrection also has bearing on us. If he rose, we will rise. That's what he is saying here. Verse 11, and not only this, but we also exalt in Elohim. Again, it's kind of almost King Jamesy English. We look forward to the glory. We're looking forward to the glory is what it's saying. Through our Master Yeshua Messiah, through whom we have now received the restoration to favor or to grace. Okay, let's just go forward a little bit. John chapter 15, verses 13 to 14. Again, Yeshua is the baseline. Did Yeshua say any of the stuff that Shaul just said? Yes, multiple times actually. John 15, verses 13 and 14. No greater love than this. No one has greater love than this, that one should lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do whatever I command you. I just realized that second part was in there, but there you go. You are my friends if you do. But the issue is, did Yeshua already tell us that his death will have an effect on us, will change things? Yes, that's the baseline. That's already there. So again, Shaul is not coming up with something new. And Yeshua says this multiple times. In fact, I think Yeshua even said that maybe for a good man, someone might die. I think Yeshua actually says those very words as well. I don't remember where. Again, maybe one of you guys that are online, you guys can look that up and put that out there for people to see. But did Yeshua say the very same thing that we just read in Romans? Yes, he did. It's not new. It's already been said, Yeshua. So is Shaul telling us anything differently than from what Yeshua has already said? No, he is not. He is absolutely not. All right, so the next verse is verse 11, I believe. And it says, and not only this, so this we're just continuing on in the actual, the reading of Romans 5. And not only this, but we also exalt in Elohim through our Master Yeshua Messiah, through whom we now have received the restoration to favor. We just read that verse. For this reason, even as through one man sin did enter the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men, because all sinned. Now, I want to take some time here to make sure that we understand this, because he's going to build the next few verses from here to the end of the chapter. He is going to build on a major concept that is so misunderstood. Part of it, we get some of it. I got to admit, we get some of it, but a good portion of it, we kind of, I guess it gets convoluted in I guess in the way our culture has come, or the way that our religion has grown over the days. Let's understand what he's saying here. That, and he's telling us if his death restores us from being enemies to now being in favor, and his life then will also grant resurrection, he's now going to give us the other side. And he's going to explain to us the predicament that we're actually in. And now we're going not all the way back to Abraham. Now we're going back to the root problem, where all of this started, which goes all the way back still to the Torah, but all the way back to the story of Adam. And he's telling us that because of the one man, and of course the man he is speaking of here is Adam. This is the whole story of the garden. I didn't put the scriptures up there. We can, I think we've kind of gone over that story many times. You guys know the story. But Adam is given Torah. He's not given the written Torah the way Moses wrote it down, but he is given the instruction of Yah to guard, just like we are to guard the commandments. He is told to guard the garden, to uphold it, to protect it, to tend it. And of all the things you can do, there's one I don't want you to do, and you know the story. He does that. When you disobey Yah's instruction, his Torah, that is sin. Guys, where does the definition of sin actually come from? Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. That's it. That's the beginning. So if we are all sinners, we have all done what Adam did. And so what he's saying is that by this one man, by this one act of disobedience, that death entered the world. And we know, when you read the story, it says, and Yah clearly warns both Adam and Eve that the day you do this, knowing that they're going to do it, the day you do this, you will die. Now, there's no written Torah yet. There's the oral instruction that God gave to Adam, but there's nothing written yet. Even though there's no written Torah yet, death still reigned. So Adam died, and Seth died, and obviously Abel died. He's murdered. Death began to reign. Eventually, Eve died. They all died. And not just them, but we're going to find out, it says in yellow, and thus death spread to all men. There's no Torah yet. But people are dying. Why are they dying? Well, now we, after the fact, some 2,000 years after this is written, almost 6,000 years after the events, we now can look back and realize they died without a written Torah. They died because of sin, because what Adam's rebellion, Yah said, when you do this, when you do this, you will surely die. Today, we can maybe think of it along the lines of disease, though this is not a disease. We like to call everything a disease today. All of our behaviors and stuff, and this was a choice. But think of it along the lines of a disease, that it was passed on from person to person to person to person. And the eventual result of this disease, so to speak, this affliction, is death. And death reigned from Adam all the way to Moses, even though there was no Torah, which later on declares that the whole story of this happening, it still happened without any written Torah. People still died. They still suffered the consequences of disobedience. Verse 13, for until the Torah, sin was in the world, but sin is not reckoned. Every time you see that word reckoned, it means recognized, understood, I guess is maybe a better way of, wrapping our minds around it. We don't really use the word, reckoned today. But so this is really an important point. It's exactly what I just said, that even though there was no written Torah, death reigned from Adam and everybody on. Now, obviously, much, much longer lifespans, very, very different world. But what Yah said would happen, because the wage of sin is death, which we now are, I'm jumping ahead to chapter 6, but we know that now, it was still there, no matter what. For until, and that word until, it's very often in English, we think until means that, it's everything stops when the thing on the other side of the until comes, and that's not necessarily so. We're going to define the word until, because it can really be misleading in some verses that Shaul uses, because if you don't understand what the until is referring to, you can come to some really wrong conclusions, especially if you don't have the baseline understanding, a foundational understanding of what Yeshua actually taught. But he's saying, for until the Torah, sin was already in the world. It was in the world the day Adam and Eve did what they did. It was already there. Though there was no written Torah, it was already there. But sin is not recognized when there is no Torah. So the people that were dying knew that they were going to die. They knew the story. I'm sure Adam passed it down. But they had no concept, or what he's telling us is, there was no concept that the wage of sin is death, that now all men will die. There was no concept. That's what he's telling us. There was nothing written to instruct people with this information. Not yet, anyway. There was nothing written. But that doesn't mean that sin didn't reign. It doesn't mean that death didn't reign. So again, he's trying to give us a little bit of information on the purpose of the Torah, or one of the purposes of the Torah. Let me read again verse 13. For until the Torah, sin was in the world, but sin is not recognized when there is no Torah. What he's saying is, they didn't know everything that was sin. Yeah, they know they were dying, but did they know that, I'm just going to throw some crazy stuff out there, did they know that lying is sin? Did they know that adultery was sin? Did they know that covetousness was sin? No. Clearly, they could not. They knew they died. They knew that what Adam did was affecting them, but the definition, the description, the detailed information to recognize what is right and what is wrong had not been given, but death reigned. Sin was in the world, but sin is not recognized when there is no Torah. Doesn't mean it still doesn't do what it does. It's just not recognized. But death reigned from Adam to Moses, to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all of them. Death reigned. Why? Because of what Adam did, because that's the progression of sin. until Moses, even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam, who is a type of him who is to come. So he's setting up Adam as a type, but he's telling us, listen, there were people that didn't eat of the tree. They couldn't. They got kicked out of the garden. So they didn't do the same sin that Adam did. They didn't hear the voice of Yah tell them, you can do this and this and this and this, but if you do this, you're going to die. They didn't sin according to that sin, but they did sin. But it wasn't recognized yet until the time of Moses, until the time at Sinai. Then Yah at Sinai will define not for just the 12 tribes, but for the world what sin actually is. When the definitions given to us in the Torah will always be the definitions. We can't change it now that we've come 2,000 years later. The sin is sin. It is the transgression of the law, the transgression of the thing that defines what sin is. Now it's setting up Adam as a parallel, as a type to help us understand what's actually going to happen in this story. Let's go on just a little bit. I said that word until, and I want to define it because there's some verses, again, some of the things that Shaul says, if you don't understand the whole story, you can definitely get misunderstood and go off in incorrect places. Like, as I said before, we're not under the law. You don't understand all the parameters around it, all of the nuances about it. Yeah, you can come to the conclusion, as many of us did, until our eyes were open. The word until is the Greek, now we're reading it in the Greek, 891, it's the word akri. And it comes from the word akron, which is actually number 206. And it means through the idea of terminus, of time. The very next, of time, until, or, of a place, or of place, or it has a place in time. Up to, as far as, for, or into, till, even unto, to, until, or while. So in English, when we see the word until, that something happens until, the definition in English is that, well, that until means everything ends. Everything is up until this, and then everything, it ends. Whatever came before ended, and now something different. And that's error. That's not the definition. That's not what we just read. That's not what the word means. And yet that's how we use it. And I get that. And there's truth in that to a degree. But here's the problem. It does not mean an ending of something. Galatians 3:19. Here's the problem. Look at this verse. Why then the Torah? Because Shaul is explaining the same thing in Galatians that he's talking about here. Why then the Torah? It was added because of transgressions until, and it's carried through time, like we just said, until the seed should come to whom the promise was made. And here's the problem. People look at that, and guys, when I first read this years ago, I thought it meant this, that it's saying that the Torah is only valid until Messiah comes. That is not what this is saying. Not at all. It is a tutor. It is a placeholder. It is the thing that goes through time to get us to Messiah. But the purpose of the Torah is still valid for us today, and there's multiple purposes of it. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 18. Again, Yeshua must be the baseline. He must be the foundation. What does Yeshua say about the Torah, the Word? Now, there's a whole lot of places where it speaks about this, but I'm just pulling out chapter 5, verse 18. And as a matter of fact, he uses the word till here. For truly I say till, there's a time in history till heaven and earth pass away, one yod, one jot, or one tittle shall by no means pass from the Torah till all be done. Well, there's still a heaven, there's still an earth. And if you read just a few verses on in Matthew chapter 5, he'll go on to say, anyone who breaks the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so is least in the kingdom of heaven. He goes on, of course, we read 22, do what Moses says, don't do what the Pharisees say. So did Yeshua clearly teach a place for the Torah? Did he teach that it ends with him, or did he teach that until heaven and earth pass away, all that is written in it, not a jot of it, will be changed, done away with, removed? Yes, that's what he taught. So can we then read Galatians 3:19 and read that, well, the Torah is a tutor, and it was until Yeshua came, and now we don't need it. If you do that, you're reading into it. What is that called? Exegesis. You're reading into it as instead of exegesis, reading out of it what's actually being said. What's actually being said, the baseline is what Yeshua said. Not one jot, not one tittle. Obey Moses. Don't do what the Pharisees teach and do. They're the blind leading the blind. So, and I'm just using this because this is one of those verses that I'm sure people will try to, use as a discussion, or you should understand, so that when you're speaking to someone, you've got a little background on it, that this does not mean that the Torah is valid until Messiah, the seed, comes. That is not its meaning. It is a time throughout history leading us up to where he is, as far as to where he is, but it does not pass away, not by Yeshua's own words. So just a little bit extra, I know, a little trip around the mountain, but it's important because I've heard this before. You will bump into it from time to time as you discuss this with people. All right, go back to where we just were. So the conversation is continuing now, but the favorable gift is not like the trespass. So he just told us about the trespass. One guy does it, it affects everybody. The Torah comes, and death still reigns, even though people don't know exactly all the different definitions of sin. It still reigns from Adam all the way to Moses. But the favorable gift is not like the trespass. He's using it as a comparison, but it's not exactly like it. For if by the one man's trespass, many died, much more the favor of Elohim and the gift in favor of the one man, Yeshua Messiah, overflowed to many, to all. For God so loved the world. This gift is for everybody, guys. Everybody on the planet has opportunity for this gift. And the favorable gift is not as by one having sinned. So he says, okay, yeah, Adam is a type of the way one does it, and it affects many. Yes, Yeshua's one, and it affects many, but it doesn't work the same way. There's something different. It's not like when Adam sinned and everybody, you didn't have to do anything. It automatically get passed down to you. That's not the way grace works. That's not the way favor works. For indeed, the judgment was one to condemnation, but the favorable gift is of many trespasses unto righteousness. Very, very important statement. I'm going to show it to you in a picture in just a second. But the one act brings condemnation to all. All of the sinful acts, think about all of the sinful acts of all of humanity from the time of Adam all the way to when we are here. How big that must be. All of those things in opposition to the way the trespass came, all of those things are done away with one act, that is the death and resurrection of Messiah. For if by the trespass of the one, death did reign through the one, much more those who receive the overflowing favor and the gift of righteousness shall reign in life through the one, Yeshua Messiah. One brings death to all, the other brings life to many. They're similar. You can understand them as a comparison, but they are not the same. And you're going to see why, and hopefully you'll be able to understand this a little bit, because you need to understand this. And I hope we can get this. You can get this through the picture that I'm going to show you. But let's read on just a little bit, and then we'll go back. I want to show you some pictures. So the next verse, verse 18. So then, as through one trespass there resulted condemnation to all men. One guy, everyone dies. So also through one righteous act, Yeshua Messiah, there resulted righteous declaration of life to all men, to whosoever will. For as through the disobedience, again, what did Adam do? He disobeyed. He sinned. He broke God's law. For through the disobedience of one man, many, all, were made sinners. So also through the obedience of one, many shall be made righteous. Not all. Many shall be made righteous. Remember, the gift is not like the trespass. And the Torah came in beside, so that the trespass would increase. Now that's you read that, it sounds like the Torah wanted to make sin worse. Well, when it means a trespass would increase, it would amplify, it would magnify, it would shine a light on. Everybody's dying. Everybody's dying. From Adam to Moses, everybody's dying. When Moses comes along, now we find out why we're dying, what we're doing, the things that we are doing that are bringing death to us. And we're told the things that we can do that will not bring death to us, so long as we come by faith first, the way Abraham did. And the Torah came in beside, so that the trespass would increase. So that's what it means when it says the trespass would increase. It doesn't mean it's making the trespass worse. Can't get much worse than death. It means it's increasing the knowledge of the trespass. It's magnifying, it's informing us. We are now reckoning, we are recognizing from not just, again, this is not for the house of Israel alone. This was supposed to be for the world. This Yah's using the house of Israel, but this is information the world needs to know, because death was upon all of us. Every one of us. That's what we just read. And the only way to understand the details of why this is in and through the Torah. But where sin increased, favor increased still more. Really, really important verse. Really, 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 really important. Because think about it. Adam sinned, that's one guy. And, and his children, and his children's children, that's, thousands. And, 500 years later, maybe a million, 2 million. Sin got bigger and bigger. And then once the Torah comes and shines a light and says, and this is sin, and this is disobedience, and this is disobedience, and this is disobedience, and this is obedience, and this is obedience. The Torah brings death. It shows you that what death, why you're dying, but it also shows life at the same time. Remember, the Torah has manifold manifestations of it. There's a Torah of faith, there's a Torah of life, there's a Torah of death. All of these things are true at the same time. So where sin increased, think of how much sin has increased as population has increased, as our rebellion against Yah has increased. Sin has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And by the time Moses is there, and now it's laid out as to what is sin, now we realize, oh my goodness, it's even bigger. There's things we were doing we didn't even realize we were doing. And now it's bigger and bigger and bigger. And the bigger sin got, the bigger the forgiveness and the grace of Yah has to be to restore us to right standing. Very important point. So the more we have sinned, the more in sin we are, the greater the favor, the greater the grace of our God to put us in right standing with him. Now you gotta be careful with this, because we misunderstand what very often what this is actually telling us. We take it to mean that, well, then that means the more I do, God's grace is just going to be on me, because that's where sin increases, grace increases. No. That's not the way the gift works. Verse 21. So that as sin did reign in death, even so favor might reign through righteousness to everlasting life through Yeshua Messiah, our Master. Now, let's take a look at this. This is a chart, a picture, to try to help you understand what was just said. Adam, the one guy up there in yellow, has made everybody yellow. And the product, the end product of that, whether they know it or not, whether they understood what they were doing to be sin or not to be sin, the end result is death. That's what we just finished reading. Yeshua now comes. The yellow, those that are sinners. Remember, sin is breaking Yah's commandment. Adam did it, and so did everybody else. Not the same way he did, but they all did it, even though nothing was written yet. All of those yellow dots, all of those people, just like the one man made them all yellow, made them all die, Yeshua, death and resurrection, now makes them in right standing. They are no longer yellow. They're no longer sinners. They're no longer in rebellion, or should not be in rebellion against God. They should no longer be enemies to God. While they were yellow, they were enemies to God. And now that they are not, now that we are in favor, now that we have a righteous standing in him, we are now, if he we are in his death and his life, just like him, we become those little white dots. We also now will live. Pretty straightforward stuff. Most would probably look at that and be able to understand that. However, the bigger the sin we just read, the bigger the rebellion, the bigger the grace and the favor had to be to restore us. You know, if you stole $100 from somebody and somebody stole $1,000,000 from somebody, the forgiveness of $100 is one thing, but the forgiveness of $1,000,000 is bigger. The bigger the sin, the bigger the grace had to be, or has to be made in right standing with Yah. So look at the picture for a second. Why is this so? Because the Torah came. Notice the word Torah is up there. Those dots are much, much bigger than these dots. This is death reigning from Adam to Moses. Moses comes. Now the Torah explains exactly what sin is in detail, and what it does, and what righteousness is in detail, and how to do it. And now we begin to realize, oh my goodness, our sin is huge. It's big, and you see the bigger circles there. So the bigger the sin, the bigger the grace, the favor has to be. So when it says that Yah so loved the world, this is sin was so big. This is how big Yah's grace is to the world. However, Yeshua's grace, notice the picture under it. Some are white, some are still yellow. if God's grace was big because our sin was so much bigger, if after we understand who he is, do we keep on sinning for his grace to keep on being applied to us? Do we keep doing the big sin or just sin in general so that more grace can be added to us? No, absolutely not. We were supposed to go from being sinners leading to death to being made right with him, leading to life. And that's the how? By the horse. And then comes the cart. So again, the question is, and here's the issue of where we are today. Here's the issue of what we've done. We teach people, we've told people, the grace of God is on you. God's gonna forgive. He's gonna, no, doesn't matter what you do. God's grace is there. God's grace was there to put you in right standing with him. Now that you are in right standing with him, and you now have the Torah that tells us what righteousness is and what righteousness is not, what it means to live righteously and what it means to sin, should you still be living as a sinner? That is, in disobedience to God's instruction. Or should you now, since you've been made right or given favor with him, should you now be doing what he has asked of us to do? Those are the white dots. This is exactly the question that Shaul presents to us in Romans chapter 6 and verse 1. What then shall we say? Shall we continue to sin, disobey God's instructions, his written Torah that defines all that sin is and all that it's not, so that God's grace or favor may increase on us? Let it not be. That's kind of King Jamesy English for heck no. Absolutely not. How shall we who died to sin by that white dot, that Yeshua, how shall we who died to sin still live in it? This is so key, so important, so big. We're going to stop right here for now. I hope you've gotten this much of it. Again, we're going to pick up some of this conversation on our hidden manna for this upcoming weekend for Shabbat. We're going to continue talking about the story of grace. But now, as we get into chapter 6, Shaul's now going to begin to talk to us about the cart. 1 to 5, he's talked to us about the horse. Now he's going to talk to us about the cart, and those pictures that we just saw. Hopefully they give you hopefully they clarified a little bit of it for you. But we cannot stay in the position that leads to death and say that we have come by faith in him, that we are justified in him. When we truly are justified, and when our hearts are circumcised, his Torah, we are told in Hebrews, is written on our hearts. It doesn't mean that you automatically know everything that is right and wrong. It means that when you read it, when you learn it, when you understand it, as you grow and you grow and you grow, you want to do what is right before him, not to earn his justification. You want to do it because you have his justification and because you love him. If you love me, obey my commandments. We'll leave it right there for tonight, guys. I hope you enjoyed that study. I know a lot of information. Listen to it again. Go over it. Take notes. Maybe take some screenshots of those pictures, and maybe it'll help you describe it to someone else another day. Guys, again, I hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to join us tomorrow morning for our morning manna. And then, of course, as I said, this weekend for our hidden manna, where we'll talk about grace. And then we're going to continue with the series that we're doing of the woman, the dragon, and the children for our week weekend message. So, guys, with all of that stuff, again, thanks for hanging out with me tonight. God bless. And as always, shalom.